Today, on the Renutrin Podcast, I'll talk about the Mediterranean diet. What are the specific foods and beverages that are recommended while consuming this type of dietary pattern? I'll also go into the scientific studies, mostly are related to cardiovascular disease, that really show that the Mediterranean diet is the number one diet that's been recommended for over 7 years by the U.S. News and World Report. I'll also talk about the key nutrients and bioactive compounds that are found in these foods that confer health benefits. For example, extra virgin olive oil is rich in monounsaturated fat, and it has antioxidant properties. So we'll delve into some of those individual nutrients while, we actually consume foods, not individual nutrients, but there are specific nutrients found in the foods that are consumed while following a Mediterranean dietary pattern that will be beneficial for overall health, especially cardiovascular health. At the end of the podcast, I'll provide 3 key tips, simple, easy tips that will allow you to renew your nutrition and follow a Mediterranean diet more closely. First, let's talk about the physiologist that actually discovered a link between Mediterranean-type foods and risk of chronic disease, in particular heart disease and stroke. His name is Ansel Keys, and he was a professor at the University of Minnesota, and he noticed that there was a link between overweight Minnesota men who were professionals and the risk of heart disease when compared to European men that were undergoing post-war famine. In this relationship, he was able to link back to diet. These unhealthy Minnesota men were typically overweight, they had high blood pressure, and they had a higher risk of cardiovascular events such as stroke. He noticed that they consumed a diet high in saturated fat and lower amounts of monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats. So talking about fat, saturated fat is found in animal products. You can think of it as being a solid fat at room temperature. So it's kind of the white fat that you find surrounding the meat portion of a steak, for example. It's also found in butter. So if you put butter, real butter, out on the countertop at room temperature, it's going to remain solid. And the reason is because these saturated fats are linear in shape. They're saturated with hydrogen, and that allows for these linear saturated fats to compact really tightly together. And that's why these fats are solid at room temperature. When we talk about unsaturated fats or unsaturated fatty acids, these have a double bond. So we're taking away 2 of those hydrogens, and that double bond allows for the linear structure to form a kink. And this kink is important in fluidity. So if you think of foods and ingredients that are high in unsaturated fatty acids, like olive oil, it's going to be fluid or liquid at room temperature because of those kinks. It allows for some rotation and movement. Now, there are 2 types of unsaturated fatty acids. There's monounsaturated, which has 1 double bond, and then there's polyunsaturated, which has more than 1 double bond. It could have 2, 3, 4. So we'll kind of talk about these saturated and unsaturated fats, unsaturated comprising of mono and polyunsaturated fats, a little bit later, and the foods that contain these specific types of fats. Now, Ansel Keys, because of this relationship that he found with saturated fat and higher risk of heart disease and having a stroke, he developed a study, and it's actually called the 7 Countries Study. And in this study, he looked at dietary patterns of men. It only included men. This was in the late 1950s, and men were really the subject of almost all research studies at this point in time. What Ansel Keys found was that the men who were living in countries surrounding the Mediterranean Sea, such as Greece, Italy, and Spain, Croatia. They all had healthier dietary patterns, so they had lower intakes of saturated fat, higher intakes of unsaturated fat. They ate more plants, so more fruits, vegetables, whole grains. They didn't eat a lot of red meat. They were active. They had a lower BMI, and they had a lower risk of heart disease and cardiovascular events. So this relationship was characterized by something called the Mediterranean diet. This was one of the first observations of this Mediterranean type of eating. So he found that the men consuming this Mediterranean type of diet, living around the Mediterranean Sea, were healthier compared to men living in the United States and in Northern Europe. There are some caveats with this study. Not everybody agrees with this saturated fat relationship. And here's why. Because the initial study actually contained 22 countries, but the publication only included 7 studies. So it appeared that Dr. Keys seemed to eliminate some of the data, which we know now is not proper science. You don't come up with a research question and hypothesis and collect data according to pre-planned methods, and then later on eliminate over half of the data points because the data doesn't fit the story that the researcher is trying to tell or believes in. That's definitely injecting a lot of bias into science, and so that is not the correct way to do proper science. So what Dr. Keys did is he eliminated France, because France, even though they had higher intakes of saturated fat and they smoked more than other men in other countries, they still had a lower incidence of heart disease. So he decided to eliminate France. Also, the data collected in Greece was during Lent, and this typically is when less amounts of red meat are consumed. So there's still some speculation in the scientific community about this 7-country study. And one other thing is Dr. Keys failed to mention that sugar actually had a bigger relationship on developing heart disease and other cardiovascular events. He left out sugar, which could have been the potential driver in this case for developing chronic diseases. Other studies have shown that adults living in Greece and Italy have a higher life expectancy. They also have lower risk of developing heart disease, cancer. They're less likely to be overweight or obese. So they're typically a healthier population in general. In addition to consuming plants, they consume olive oil, especially extra virgin olive oil. And that seems to be one of the main components in the Mediterranean diet that is helpful in reducing cardiovascular disease. Since Ansel Keys made this discovery about the Mediterranean countries and their dietary profile, over 12,000 studies have been published on the Mediterranean diet. I simply did a PubMed search just a few days ago, and over 12,000 studies came up. And I use the search term Mediterranean diet. So you can see it is very popular. But what I want to describe next are 3 really important studies that have been conducted in Spain on the Mediterranean diet. These are randomized controlled trials. So you have 2 groups, or we could have 3 groups. And these groups are randomized to either an intervention or a control. In this case, the very first study that was conducted in the early 2000s is called the PREDIMED study. So it's a prevention of cardiovascular disease using the Mediterranean diet. The first randomized controlled trial was done in the early 2000s and included 800 individuals between 55 and 80 years old. They all had an increased risk of developing cardiovascular disease, or they had type 2 diabetes. And they were randomized to one of 3 groups. The first group was instructed to consume a Mediterranean diet, plus they were given a liter of olive oil per week. And now this was distributed to their family. They were told to cook with the olive oil, to drizzle it on salads and whole grains, and other foods. So these individuals were to use the extra virgin olive oil as their primary source of fat. The second group was instructed to consume a Mediterranean diet, and they were given 30 grams of nuts. And if you want to know the specific nuts, it's 7 to 8 almonds, 7 to 8 hazelnuts, and 2 walnuts. So it's really just a handful of nuts that they were to consume each day. And the third group was educated and instructed to consume a low-fat diet. They were followed for 3 months, and at the end of the 3-month period, both of the Mediterranean diet groups had improvements in blood glucose, had improvements in cholesterol. Actually, they had a lower cholesterol to HDL cholesterol ratio. They also had improvements in systolic blood pressure as well as other outcomes. In the olive oil group only, they had improvements in inflammation, in particular C-reactive protein, also known as CRP. So this one short-term study found that consuming a Mediterranean diet with olive oil or nuts was beneficial on cardiovascular disease outcomes. The next study, called PREDIMED Plus, was also conducted in Spain and was published in 2013. And this study looked at the long-term effects of consuming a Mediterranean diet. Long-term meaning 1 year. So they actually had 2 groups in this particular study. It included over 600 individuals between 55 and 75 years of age, and these individuals all had what's called metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome is diagnosed as having 3 of the 5 following conditions: abdominal obesity, elevated triglycerides, elevated fasting glucose, high blood pressure, and a low HDL cholesterol, which is our protective cholesterol. These individuals are randomized into one of 2 groups. The first group was educated and instructed by dietitians to follow a Mediterranean diet, plus they received extra virgin olive oil and the nuts, as I described in the previous study. They were also told to reduce their body weight and increase their physical activity. The second group was instructed to consume a Mediterranean diet as well, but they were not provided free foods and they were not instructed to lose weight or increase their activity. At the end of 1 year, the individuals that were on the Mediterranean diet plus EVOO and nuts lost an average of 7 pounds. And that's compared to the control diet that lost an average of 1.5 pounds. The Mediterranean diet also showed improvements in blood glucose, hemoglobin A1C, insulin, and insulin resistance. They also had improved lipids. They also had improvements in some inflammatory markers. The one thing that did not differ between groups was blood pressure. However, you can see that over a year, just by adding extra virgin olive oil and nuts and consuming a plant-based diet that is high in mono and polyunsaturated fatty acids, rich in antioxidants, can improve health outcomes. In a more recent study that was published in 2022 looked at the Mediterranean diet on the secondary prevention of cardiovascular disease events. So these were people that already had heart disease. So it had already been established, and they were recruited and randomized to receive the Mediterranean diet. Plus, they were instructed to consume 4 tablespoons of EVOO per day. So they were given the olive oil. The other group was to consume a low-fat diet. And they followed these individuals with heart disease over 7 years. And what they found was quite remarkable. The Mediterranean group had a 26% reduction in cardiovascular events at the end of the trial. The men actually had better improvements in cardiovascular events with a 33% reduction, and that was compared to the control group. So you can have established heart disease and consume a Mediterranean diet, and that can show improvements in having another cardiovascular event or stroke. This diet can be implemented really at any time, any condition, any symptom, and it can improve overall health. So let's discuss the specific foods that are consumed using this Mediterranean diet pattern. And there was a pyramid that was developed, And I think it's a good representation of what you should do if you want to follow this particular dietary pattern. The bottom of the pyramid includes physical activity. It includes being nice to others, cooking as a family or with friends, being social. Also, getting enough water. You want to make sure you're drinking at least 6 to 8 glasses of water or other non-caloric beverages every day. So that's very important. So at the bottom, this has to be done every day. And then the next tier is something that you need to do at every meal. So at every meal, you want to consume 2 fruits, 2 or more vegetables, whole grains, and extra virgin olive oil. So that's at every meal, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Every day, you should consume 2 servings of nuts or seeds, olives, also low-fat dairy. And you also want to use herbs to season the food instead of salt or other salt-type seasonings. So that's every day. And then every week, you should consume 2 to 3 servings of fish, such as salmon, tuna, mackerel. Seafood is also acceptable. Lean meats are also recommended. Lean white meat, so at least 2 servings of those, which would include chicken, any kind of poultry, and pork. You also want to include weekly servings of beans, peas, and legumes, and anywhere between 2 to 4 eggs per week. Now, what you want to limit while consuming a Mediterranean diet is red meat, processed foods, and that includes processed meats like your sausages, your lunch meats, your bacon, things like that. You also want to limit those sugary beverages or anything with added sugar. Okay, natural sugar is fine. So fruits contain natural sugar. You don't want to eliminate natural sugars from your diet. We're talking about added sugars, and those added sugars are going to be in those soft drinks. You also want to limit your desserts. So limit those cookies and ice creams and cakes and all of the things that taste really yummy, you want to limit. And the Mediterranean diet also includes red wine, 1 glass per day for women, 2 glasses per day for men. However, there is a trial that is underway to look at the impact of red wine on the Mediterranean diet to see if it actually does have any type of benefit. There is some recent research that's come out that is saying no amount of alcohol is beneficial on overall health. And so we will see with this new trial coming out if red wine should still be listed on the Mediterranean diet or if it should be removed. Now I'll delve into the magic nutrients. So these are the nutrients found in the foods on the Mediterranean diet that confer health benefits. When I say nutrients, that means vitamins and minerals, but there's also bioactive compounds in these foods, such as antioxidants. There's also things like polyphenols. So these are all compounds that are not necessarily nutrients per se, but they have been shown to have some type of benefit on health. The very first that I want to highlight, of course, is EVOO. One thing about extra virgin olive oil is it has a high smoke point. That means you can heat it up to about 400 degrees Fahrenheit, and it will still confer its health properties. However, if you heat EVOO over that 400 degrees, you're going to start to break down the antioxidants, and it will also produce unhealthy compounds that you don't want to ingest. So EVOO is good for cooking. It's great for drizzling over any type of pasta or whole grain, vegetable. So you really can use EVOO with every meal and incorporate it into your daily lifestyle. Remember, 4 tablespoons per day of EVOO was consumed on these Mediterranean diet interventions. So it's quite a bit of EVOO that you want to try and ingest. The other key nutrients, magic nutrients, are the mono and polyunsaturated fatty acids. These fatty acids are going to be found in your EVOO, also in some of your whole grains, your nuts and seeds, as well as avocados. So they're going to be the healthier types of dietary fats as opposed to the saturated fats that are found in animal products like red meat, butter, dairy. The next nutrient is omega-3 fatty acids. So omega-3 fats are an essential fatty acid. So we must obtain these essential fats in our diet. We cannot make them in our body from other compounds. Omega-3 fatty acids, there's actually two essential fatty acids. There's omega-6, which is called linoleic acid, and then there's omega-3, which is called alpha-linolenic acid. Omega-3 is found in fatty fish. It's also found in some of our nuts and seeds like chia seeds. Walnuts are a good source. It's found in algae, soybeans. So omega-3s confer anti-inflammatory properties. So you want to have a diet high and rich in omega-3 fatty acids. And surprisingly, eggs can have a high amount of omega-3 fatty acids if the chicken's diet contained omega-3 fats. So it's what the chicken eats. That's what's found in the actual egg yolk. And so you do have some of those eggs that are rich in omega-3s, as well as some other functional foods and designer foods. Vitamin E is another magic nutrient that's found in our nuts and seeds and whole grains. Vitamin E is really important because it acts as an antioxidant in our cells. So it actually sits inside of our membranes that surround our organelles and our cells. And that vitamin E eradicates the formation of reactive oxygen species. And so those are also known as free radicals. If you have a lot of free radical buildup, it can damage our DNA, it can damage our membranes, and damage our cells. So we want to make sure we have enough vitamin E in our diet to protect ourselves from those free radicals. Fiber is another key nutrient that's found in fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. Fiber is necessary because it removes toxins from our body through the stool. It also promotes satiety and feelings of fullness. It can also benefit our gut microbiome if the fiber is fermentable. And we'll have a whole podcast on the gut microbiome and fermentable fibers because there's so much information that is too much for this particular podcast session. We also have in the Mediterranean foods phytochemicals. So an example would be carotenoids that are found in our red and orange and yellow vegetables. We also have polyphenols that are found in tea and coffee and even grapes, which is probably why red wine is associated with the diet, and also some of the berries. Lastly, we have vitamin D. Vitamin D is not normally found in our food supply. That's why dairy is fortified with vitamin D, but we do get vitamin D from fatty fish. So that is why salmon, mackerel, tuna, those are recommended on the Mediterranean diet. Now, you can also go outside during the summer months without sunscreen and expose your arms for about 10 minutes and get vitamin D that way. But you can also consume fatty fish, which is a recommendation on the Mediterranean diet. So in summary, the Mediterranean diet has been ranked number 1 for the past 7 years for a reason. There are randomized clinical trials showing clear benefits on overall health, especially cardiovascular health. You definitely cannot go wrong consuming a Mediterranean diet. It clearly has those benefits and it goes beyond just cardiovascular disease. Now I want to give you 3 simple tips if you want to eat more Mediterranean type of foods. The first simple task is to switch out your existing oils and use extra virgin olive oil when you cook and when you drizzle over foods. EVOO is one of the main drivers of health on this particular diet. Next is eat a handful of nuts in the afternoon. This is when we all get a little cranky. Maybe our lunch has worn off and our blood sugar is starting to dip, and we just want to go home and eat a bag of potato chips. Well, if you eat a handful of nuts, your cravings can be curbed. Now, even better, you can add these nuts to Greek yogurt, as well as throw in some berries, and you have a very high protein, very nutritious snack that will hold you over until you eat your late meal of the day. And lastly is to eat fruit for dessert. Try and switch out your confectionery type of sweets with a fruit. And I want to tell a story. My grandfather, who I lost over a year and a half ago, he loved cantaloupe. And cantaloupe is in season. I live in Texas, so cantaloupe usually comes on the market springtime and in the summer. Cantaloupe, if you can get the really ripe, sweet type, very nutritious. And I remember he would eat cantaloupe for dessert, and we were all eating cookies or cake or, this is when I was little. But he opted for the cantaloupe. And interestingly, he sprinkled a little bit of salt and pepper on the cantaloupe, and that salt enhanced the sweetness of the cantaloupe. So he really learned to use fruit to his advantage, especially after a meal. This is the conclusion of the Renutrin Podcast. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you again in our next session.